Let me give you a number that should immediately settle the title question, and then I want to explain why it doesn't. As of March 2026, Microsoft Windows holds 60.8% of global desktop and laptop market share. 60.8%. Linux desktops, it's at 3.2% by the same measurement. Zorin OS is a fraction of that 3.2%. So in the most literal, straightforward interpretation of the question, is Zorin OS 18.1 ending Windows dominance? The answer is obviously no. Windows runs on more than half of every computer on the planet. Zorin OS runs on a number that requires a decimal point to express as a percentage. Case closed. Video over. See you next time. Except that's not how technological dominance actually works, and anyone who has been paying attention to what's happened in the desktop operating system space over the last 18 months knows that the raw market share number is the least interesting part of this story, because the more meaningful questions, the ones that tell you what's actually happening beneath the headline statistic, are about direction, momentum, and trust. And on all three of those dimensions, the story looks very different from what that 60% figure suggests. Here's what I mean. Linux desktop market share reached 4.7% globally in 2025, marking a 70% increase from 2.76% recorded in July 2022, a 70% increase in 3 years, on a base that had been essentially flat for most of the previous decade. That's not a distribution picking up a few enthusiast users. That's a structural shift in the trajectory of desktop computing adoption that began before the Windows 10 deadline and has continued well after it. The United States crossed the 5% threshold for the first time in June 2025. The United States, historically one of the most Windows-loyal markets in the world, where enterprise IT infrastructure is most deeply embedded in Microsoft's ecosystem, crossed 5% Linux desktop share for the first time ever. That is a milestone that most people in the Linux community genuinely did not expect to see in 2025. And then there's Windows itself. According to Gartner, in 2024 and 2025, due to lower adoption of Windows 11 and Microsoft ending its support of Windows 10, the number of PCs shipped with pre-installed Windows dropped. Analysts attribute this partly to the steep hardware requirements, especially the TPM 2.0 mandate, and to the CrowdStrike-related IT outages of 2024. Windows market share isn't declining because competitors are dramatically better. It's declining because Microsoft has been systematically eroding user trust through hardware requirements that locked out hundreds of millions of working computers, through first AI features that a majority of users disabled within a week, through 20 broken updates in 2025 alone, and through an operating system that increasingly feels like a platform serving Microsoft's interests before the users. Trust erosion and market share erosion are not the same thing in the short term. In the long term, they are. This is the context in which Zorin OS 18.1 exists, not as a David slinging a stone at a Goliath still in full strength, but as one of several increasingly capable alternatives filling the space created by a dominant platform that has been busy making itself less trustworthy, and the 3.3 million downloads that Zorin OS accumulated. In 6 months, the largest single distribution download event in Linux's mainstream history are one measurable expression of what happens when that trust erosion crosses a threshold for enough people simultaneously. I want to answer the title question properly in this video, not with a yes or a no, but with an honest examination of what Zorin OS 18.1 specifically represents in the competitive landscape, what the market share numbers are actually telling us when you look beneath the surface, what would have to be true for Linux in general, and Zorin specifically to genuinely threaten Windows dominance over the next 5 years, and where the real barriers remain, because the barriers are real, and anyone who tells you Linux is about to overtake Windows in the next 2 years is either uninformed or selling something, but anyone who tells you the current trajectory is meaningless, because Windows still has 60% is missing the most interesting technology story of the decade. Let me tell you something about market share statistics that changes how you interpret them. Market share is a lagging indicator. It tells you where things were, not where things are going. The decisions that will determine Windows market share in 2028 and 2029 are being made right now, in 2026, in government procurement offices and enterprise IT departments, in small business conversations, in the minds of individual users sitting in front of Windows 10 machines that Microsoft stopped supporting 7 months ago. The 60% number reflects yesterday's inertia. What I'm about to walk through reflects tomorrow's momentum. The first factor is trust erosion, and it has reached critical mass. I want to be specific about something that most market analysis glosses over. The erosion of user trust in Windows didn't happen suddenly. It happened gradually across a 5-year period of accumulated decisions that each seemed containable in isolation but compounded into something that changed how a significant portion of the user base fundamentally relates to Microsoft. The Windows 11 TPM 2.0 hardware requirement in 2021 was the first major rupture, millions of users discovering their functional computers were being locked out, not for genuine performance reasons, but for certification requirements that benefited Microsoft's ecosystem control more than users' security. Then came the removal of taskbar features that had existed since Windows 95, the gradual introduction of advertisements into the operating system itself, the Copilot integration that consumed RAM and surfaced in applications where users were trying to do quiet, focused work. Windows 11 only surpassed Windows 10 in installed share in late 2025, 4 years after launch, 4 years for a mandatory upgrade path to reach majority adoption within its own platform. That is not a number that reflects enthusiastic adoption. That is a number that reflects users who had no choice left after the Windows 10 deadline passed. The distinction matters enormously, because users who upgraded under duress rather than enthusiasm are exactly the users most likely to consider alternatives the next time they're forced into a computing decision. The second factor is European governments, and they are defecting at scale. This barely makes it into mainstream tech coverage, because government IT procurement decisions are slow, complicated, and don't generate viral moments. But the cumulative impact of what's been happening across European public sector computing over the last 2 years is genuinely significant. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein became the first European region to completely replace Microsoft tools with Linux in public offices as of April 2024. Not reduce, not partially transition, completely replace. Switzerland committed $231 million to build a national cloud service and passed legislation mandating that government-developed software be released as open source. The European Union is actively considering an EU Linux operating system for public administrations across all member states, and France, as Windows Central reported last week, is actively moving away from Windows and other American tools as part of a broader digital sovereignty initiative. These are not small organizations running experiments. These are sovereign governments making multi-year infrastructure commitments based on the conclusion that dependency on a single American software vendor represents an unacceptable strategic risk. The significance for our question isn't the immediate market share impact government. Computing is a relatively small slice of total desktop installations. The significance is what it signals about the direction of institutional trust in Microsoft's platform. When governments that have been on Windows for 30 years start making the financial and operational commitment to leave, they're communicating something about their long-term confidence in the platform's alignment with their interests, and that signal travels. Enterprise IT departments notice what governments do. The third factor is enterprise Linux momentum, and it is structural. Among Fortune 500 companies, 72.6% already run mission-critical workloads on Linux on the server side. What's newer and more significant for the desktop conversation is what happened after July 2024, when a faulty update to a Windows security tool caused the largest IT outage in history, affecting 8.5 million Windows machines, grounding planes, shutting down hospitals, crashing ATM networks globally. The CrowdStrike incident changed how enterprise IT risk assessment thinks about Windows monocultures in a way that no amount of Linux advocacy ever could, when a single faulty update file can simultaneously brick millions of mission-critical systems while Linux servers in the same organizations keep running unaffected. The argument for diversifying away from a single OS dependency stops being a technical preference discussion and becomes a board-level risk management conversation. It's not a stampede. Enterprise transitions don't work that way, but the direction is set, and the CrowdStrike incident gave it urgency that it didn't previously have at the executive level. The fourth factor is gaming, and nobody expected this. Linux gaming market share reached 3.05% in October 2025, the highest level since Steam for Linux launched over a decade ago. Steam's hardware survey is one of the most reliable data sources for actual OS usage because it's collected passively from active gaming sessions rather than from installation surveys. 3% of active Steam gaming sessions happening on Linux. That's not a rounding error. That's millions of active sessions per day on a platform that was considered essentially unusable for gaming 5 years ago. Valve's investment in Proton compatibility, accelerated by the commercial success of the Steam Deck, has genuinely transformed Linux gaming to the point where it's becoming a legitimate platform choice for mainstream gamers rather than an enthusiast experiment. Windows still dominates with 94% of Steam users, so Linux has a long way to go. That's honest context. But gaming has historically been one of the two unbreakable chains keeping users on Windows. When that chain weakens enough that millions of gamers are actively choosing Linux, the population of users for whom Windows is genuinely irreplaceable shrinks, not catastrophically, not immediately, but measurably, and with ongoing momentum. The fifth factor is the most specific to the Zorin OS story. Microsoft's hardware requirements permanently excluded 240 million computers from Windows 11, 240 million machines that cannot run Windows 11 regardless of what their owners want. Those machines need an operating system. They're going to get one. Some will run Windows 10 unsupported. Some will be replaced with new hardware, and an increasing number will run Linux, specifically the distributions likes or an OS that have deliberately positioned themselves as the natural landing point for exactly this situation. the permanent alternative seeker population created by the TPM 2.0. Cutoff is not a temporary migration wave that will normalize back to baseline. It's a structural addition to the Linux user base that will continue to grow as more owners of those 240 million machines decide to keep them running securely rather than replace functional hardware. Every person in that population who has a good Linux experience becomes a word-of-mouth advocate. Every advocate converts 2 or 3 people in their network. The mathematics of grassroots adoption are slow, but they compound in ways that headline download numbers don't fully capture. Zorin OS developers reported over 780,000 Windows users transitioning to Linux in the wake of the Windows 10 end-of-life announcements, with most downloads originating from Windows systems. That is one wave, there will be more. Now, within all of that context, what does Zorin OS 18.1 specifically contribute? Because there are dozens of Linux distributions that benefit from the same tailwinds. What made Zorin the one that captured 3.3 million downloads rather than any of the others? And more importantly, and this is the honest part most coverage skips, what are the genuine remaining barriers that Zorin OS cannot currently overcome, regardless of how good the software gets? The first thing Zorin OS 18.1 does that no other distribution does with the same consistency is what I'd call guided migration rather than cold substitution. Every other Linux distribution, when you install it, assumes you've already made peace with the fact that you're on a different platform and proceeds accordingly. The file manager looks different. The application launcher works differently. The settings are in different places. You adapt or you don't. Zorin OS's approach is fundamentally different. Its Windows App Detection database recognizes over 240 application installers and provides specific guidance on the best equivalent rather than just failing silently. That distinction, treating migration as a user experience problem to be solved rather than a technical hurdle to be cleared, is what separates Zorin OS from distributions that are technically equivalent but practically less accessible. The moment a Windows user tries to install familiar software and gets helpful guidance instead of a confusing error is the moment their anxiety about Linux drops measurably. It addresses directly and deliberately one of the 2 remaining major barriers to mainstream adoption: software compatibility anxiety. The second competitive advantage is visual credibility, and this sounds less important than it is. When a mainstream user who has spent years on Windows sits down at a Linux distribution for the first time, they make a judgment about whether this is serious software within approximately 30 seconds of seeing the desktop. That judgment is based almost entirely on visual signals, whether the fonts render crisply, whether the icons look contemporary, whether the overall aesthetic communicates professional quality or hobbyist project. Zorin OS establishes a level of fit and finish in those first 30 seconds that is meaningfully higher than most distributions achieve. This matters because mainstream users make decisions based on perceived quality signals, and visual quality is the most immediate and powerful one in software. The third advantage is the commercial model. Zorin OS is a commercial venture with a pro tier, which creates a different accountability relationship with quality than a donation-funded community project. Bugs that frustrate paying customers get fixed faster. User experience friction that causes paying customers to request refunds gets prioritized. The commercial feedback loop between user satisfaction and organizational sustainability is something community models simply don't replicate in the same form. In a competitive landscape where Zorin OS is trying to convince mainstream users to switch from a commercial operating system, being a commercial product with professional accountability is an advantage, not a compromise of open source principles. Now, the barriers, because intellectual honesty requires this equally. The first and largest barrier is professional software. Adobe Creative Cloud does not run natively on Linux. AutoCAD does not run natively on Linux. Specific industry accounting packages, legal software, medical record systems, engineering tools, entire professional categories are Windows only with no Linux equivalent of comparable quality. For the professional users whose workflows depend on these applications, Linux is not currently a viable primary platform regardless of how polished Zorin OS becomes. This is the single largest barrier to Linux reaching double-digit desktop market share, and it will not be resolved by better Linux distributions. It will be resolved if it is resolved by Adobe and equivalent vendors deciding the Linux market is large enough to justify development investment. That decision requires solving a chicken and egg problem. More Linux users to justify the investment, but the investment is needed to attract more Linux users. The second barrier is anti-cheat gaming. The systems that protect competitive online games, Easy Anti-Cheat, Batlie, Riot's Vanguard, either don't support Linux or support it inconsistently. Fortnite, Valorant, and several other titles with hundreds of millions of combined players do not work on Linux for users whose primary computing entertainment is these specific games. Windows is currently irreplaceable. This is technical and solvable, but it requires anti-cheat vendors to prioritize Linux support, which requires them to believe the Linux gaming market is large enough to justify the engineering investment. Here is where I ultimately land, and I want to be precise about this. Zorin OS 18.1 is not the end of Windows dominance. It is something more interesting and more historically significant than that. It is the most compelling evidence yet that Windows dominance is no longer the inevitable default outcome for the next decade of desktop computing. For most of the period from 1995 to 2020, Windows dominance wasn't primarily a consequence of Windows being the best operating system. It was a consequence of network effects, software ecosystems, hardware vendor agreements, enterprise IT standardization, and user inertia that made switching practically impossible. For most users, regardless of Windows quality, the dominance was self-reinforcing in a way that was essentially immune to competition from technically superior alternatives. macOS existed and was arguably better for many users. Linux existed and was arguably better for specific use cases. Neither made a meaningful dent because the switching cost was too high and the alternatives weren't accessible enough to the mainstream. What has changed between 2020 and 2026 is specific and important. The software ecosystem gap has narrowed significantly. Browser-based work, which now represents the majority of what most users actually do, is platform agnostic. The hardware-vendor relationship has cracked 240 million computers locked out of Windows 11 by Microsoft's own requirements. The enterprise IT standardization has been shaken. CrowdStrike demonstrated the catastrophic downside of single-platform monocultures at a scale that board-level risk committees cannot ignore, and the accessibility of alternatives has improved to the point where Zorin OS 18.1 can genuinely be described as something a non-technical user can install, use productively from day one, and prefer two windows on the same hardware. On a Hacker News thread in February 2026 titled 2026 will be my year of the Linux desktop, the discussion was treated with real engagement instead of the usual ironic dismissal that has greeted that phrase for 20 years. The year of the Linux desktop has been a running joke in tech communities for so long that the phrase itself became shorthand for naive optimism. The fact that it's now being discussed seriously rather than ironically in spaces populated by technically sophisticated people who have been following Linux for decades is a cultural signal that something genuinely different is happening. Not a rival, not victory, but a credibility shift that has real consequences for how the next generation of computing decisions gets made. So what would it actually take for Linux to reach 10% global desktop market share by 2028? Because it's worth being concrete rather than just gesturing at momentum. Current growth trajectories suggest Linux could reach 6% globally by late 2026 if current trends continue. Getting from 6% to 10% by 2028 requires for things to happen simultaneously. First, retention. The 3.3 million Zorin OS downloads need to produce users who actually stay on Linux rather than returning to Windows when the initial novelty fades. The retention battle is won or lost in the first 3 months, and it depends on the software compatibility story continuing to improve and the community support infrastructure continuing to deepen. Second, OEM partnerships. Dell, Lenovo, and HP shipping meaningful volumes of Linux preloaded consumer hardware through mainstream retail channels would change the calculus for non-technical users who currently get Windows by default simply because it came on the machine. System 76 and a few others are doing this at small scale. Mainstream scale hasn't happened yet. Third, one major professional software breakthrough. If Adobe announced a native Linux version of Creative Cloud, even a limited version, it would unlock a creative professional segment that currently has no viable Linux path and represents significant market volume. The probability of that announcement increases with every point of Linux market share growth. Fourth, continued Microsoft-owned goals. The Windows K2 project promises improvements, but Microsoft's track record of following through on user-friendly commitments while simultaneously continuing the behaviors that drove users away is not confidence-inspiring. If 2026 and 2027 produce another round of broken updates, forced AI feature expansion, and privacy setting resets after major updates, the migration wave that started in October 2025 will have a second chapter. None of those four things are certain. Some are more likely than others, but the scenario where all four happen is not fantastical. It's plausible in a way that it genuinely was not 3 years ago. Microsoft's response, the Windows K2 project quietly acknowledged in April 2026, is the clearest indicator of what Microsoft's internal assessment of the threat actually looks like. K2 is a project addressing the biggest complaints people have about Windows 11 today, an overabundance of AI features and bloat, performance issues, and reliability problems. By the end of 2026 and into 2027, Microsoft is working to get Windows 11 into a meaningfully better place. A secret internal project to fix the exact things that drove 3.3 million people to download a competitor's operating system is, in the most direct way, a large corporation. Ever acknowledges competitive threat, an acknowledgement that the situation is serious enough to require a dedicated response. But here is my honest assessment of whether K2 is sufficient to reverse the momentum. Technical improvements to Windows 11e's reliability and performance, if delivered consistently, will slow the migration rate. They will not reverse it. The people who have already switched and had a good experience are not coming back because Windows got slightly less broken. They've already discovered that their computing life works without Windows. The marginal improvement of K2 is not compelling enough to justify returning to the surveillance architecture, the advertising ID, the telemetry that can't be fully disabled, and the update anxiety that will require years of consistent delivery to overcome. Trust eroded at scale does not return because a VP published a blog post acknowledging pain points. It returns through years of consistently delivering on promises. Microsoft is at the beginning of that process, not the end of it. Zorin OS 18.1 is not the end of Windows dominance. It is the most compelling evidence yet that Windows dominance is no longer the inevitable default outcome for the next decade of desktop computing. For 30 years, asking whether Windows would remain dominant was like asking whether the sky would remain blue technically. A question, but not a meaningful one, because the answer was so obviously yes that asking it revealed a misunderstanding of how the technology industry worked in 2026. For the first time, that question has a genuinely uncertain answer, not because Zorin OS is going to replace Windows on a billion machines, but because the conditions that made Windows dominance structurally guaranteed have changed in ways that cannot be reversed by even the most earnest version of Windows K2. The trajectory has shifted, the inertia has cracked, and Zorin OS 18.1, with its 3.3 million downloads and its 18 years of deliberate engineering aimed at the exact psychological barriers that kept mainstream users on Windows, is one of the clearest expressions of that shift that currently exists. Whether that shift reaches 10% or stays at 6% depends on retention, OEM partnerships, professional software decisions, and Microsoft's ability to rebuild trust faster than it continues to erode it. Those are genuinely open questions in May 2026 in a way they have never been before, and genuinely open questions about the future of the most widely used software on Earth are worth paying attention to.